From one day to the next, everything changed. And I would say almost overnight, 25th of February 2020, I'll never forget that date. Things just started going completely crazy from a growth perspective.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs who face the critical decision. Should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny Shechnev. As a founder, coach, and author specializing in CEO succession, I interview founders, chief executives, and investors who share their stories of navigating this transition. Today, I'm speaking with Øyvind Reed, founder and ex-CEO of Whereby, a video conferencing service many of you will be familiar with. Øyvind ran Whereby until last year, when he stepped down just before the company made a big pivot. During the pandemic, when the demand for video services exploded, Whereby tried to take on Google Meet, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and all the big guys. And Øyvind did it running the global business from a tiny coastal town of only 2,000 inhabitants in Norway. So in our conversation today, we will discuss what was it like for him to run the business, make a decision to step down, and actually make it happen. Enjoy the conversation. Good morning, Øyvind. Great to have you on the podcast today. How are you?
Good morning, Evgeny. It's great to be here. Doing well. Excited about sharing my story for this podcast. Thanks for having me on, by the way.
You're welcome. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation because I know you got an interesting story to share. But let's start at the beginning. You founded Whereby over a decade ago. Can you tell me a founding story? Why did you start the company? What was your dream or your vision?
Yeah, so the story of Whereby is kind of, it's been a long story, obviously, but it's also a pretty different one from what I would call a regular startup. So the origin was actually a founding member reach out to a couple of others and asked if we would be interested in joining a company that he was founding. This was a person that had a lot of experience in the video conferencing technology space. And he was looking to start something from scratch and asked a couple of others, including me, if we would want to join as members of that team. And so my personal reason for taking part was actually way more to, rather than necessarily falling in love with the technology, because I got excited by it, but that wasn't what drew me into it. It was about building something with others, building something from scratch, something that we could say, no, we started with 2 people or 3 people and look at what we created. Like that has always been sort of like something that has been deep in me that I want to see if we have it in us to actually do that.
Yeah. So there was someone else who built the technology and you were excited by the potential of what you could create together as a team.
Exactly.
With this technology.
Exactly. So it wasn't necessarily for me love at first sight with the technology. Like I've always been more interested in the overall experience, the overall sort of like the organizational part of it, the commercial part of it, together with the technology. But it was never just about this is a product that I sort of can see a much bigger vision for. That was the founding CTO who had that sort of like idea and everything relating to the product.
Yeah. And what happened over the following decade? So you took Whereby from an idea to a globally recognized brand.
Yeah, so long story. So you have to stop me when we run out of time. But there is no such thing for us as a straight line. We had multiple hiccups. We had multiple issues where we were about to die, right? I personally moved to the US to set our US operations up, spent nearly 3 years in Boston. And for us, that didn't work at all, right? So we had a massive learning around our technology and how it was scaling, and also problems with our business model. So that was one time where we actually saw, okay, do we have it in us to go again? Like, can we regroup, go back to our home market, which was the Nordics, and then scale yet again? And so through multiple iterations, we came out with a different product and a different technology that was ultimately Whereby. And as some might remember, that company sort of exploded onto the scene as the pandemic broke out. Could write a book about those sort of like 24 months alone. But that was the kind of where there was just sort of like from one day to the next, everything changed. And I would say almost overnight, 25th of February 2020. I'll never forget that date. Things just started going completely crazy from a growth perspective.
Yeah. Everyone suddenly started to do their work online because we all had to. And yours was one of the few companies that offered a global video communications platform.
Exactly.
So of
right.
course you were at the center of all of this.
Yeah, and so it was such a fascinating time because we were one of the beneficiaries of what happened in the market, right? So we just started scaling like crazy. We had so many users coming into the system, and we could almost follow the geography in which the world sort of like went into to a closed society where we saw Asia first, right? We saw tremendous growth in Asia, then Europe, and then later in North America. So it was sort of, we could almost follow as governments were shutting down and mandating people to work from home, that our growth would just say, ooh, another growth stick. And it just kept going for 2 or 3 months where it was just mind blowing.
And your company is also unusual in that it's a relatively small business in Nordics, and you were suddenly competing overnight with far larger companies, Zoom being one of them, operating from Silicon Valley with vastly larger capital pools available to them. So yours is also a story of an underdog, a smaller company trying to compete in a suddenly booming market with established players. How did you navigate all of this?
Yeah, so it's almost like if I could call it the ultimate underdog story, right? That's definitely what it felt like. Because keep in mind, we also had Microsoft Teams and Google Meet, who were at the time investing a lot of money and resources into this new way of working, right? So they had obviously much larger resources. They obviously, if we are a bit more tactical, their level of distribution far outweighs something that a Whereby can do. But there is something really exciting about being the underdog, right? And I felt like that was the team that we had assembled. Everyone was up to the challenge. Everyone wanted to see what we could do against these big players. And I'm super happy that a lot of my team members came up with some fantastic innovation that was later adapted by the likes of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Google Meet. Stuff that you now take for granted, like anyone that's been on a video call lately now knows that a massive part of it is actually the reactions, right? Giving a thumbs up or a smile or whatever without necessarily having to interrupt the conversation. The team at Whereby was the first that actually launched that into the product. So there was a lot of good innovation that we did to improve the overall user experience. But then ultimately, you just realize that competing against these massive players is just a big challenge.
Yeah. So that was 2022. Sorry, 2020 when the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And so 2020 and 2021 were the years of significant growth driven by the huge market pool. But at the same time, you found out that it's really difficult to compete against global players.
Yeah. And that's sort of like a tricky balance for me as the CEO, right? Because at that time you have expectations from investors. We've had some world-class investors on our cap table. And so you're feeling a lot of, I wouldn't call it pressure. I would say I feel like just a great deal of responsibility towards sort of like getting the company to the growth level where we should be and just keep hitting new highs on growth consistently, right? That's the story that we've been bred to believe. That was the story that I believed in, and that's what we wanted to achieve. But at the same time, realizing that there is something fundamentally flawed in that market, because obviously it's not going to last. But I think the biggest learning for me is the one thing that I hear a lot of both VCs and great founders talk about, right? That the first time you build something, you worry about the product and the customer experience, etc. The second time you build something, you worry about distribution. And I actually think that is such a useful insight, that the distribution is actually almost like the killer feature, I would say. If you can nail down distribution, and let's be real, competing against the likes of Google Meet and Microsoft Teams, when it's embedded or included in a subscription that you have to host your G Suite product or your Microsoft Teams product, it's borderline impossible. And so the distribution is ultimately, I think, the thing that kept us from growing fast enough, not necessarily on the product side.
Yeah. And Øyvind, a couple of years after that, I believe it was in 2023 last year. You also took a decision to step down as a CEO.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
I can only speak for myself in terms of sort of like the process that I went through. It's a long process. It certainly was for me, right? Because as we all know, being the CEO of a company, when you're trying to balance what your team wants, what your investors want, what you want for yourself, over time you start to just realize that there might be something that is misaligned. And I don't think that's necessarily anyone's fault. It just happens. And I think it happens gradually. For me, it became clear that having navigated the massive changes that we went through, right? Because keep in mind, we basically went from, and I'll be fully transparent, right? But we grew from 25 people to 125. Our revenue sort of like 10x'd in the course of a few months. So everything was going that hyper growth scenario. But at the same time, when things changed and the market reopened, people could work from an office again and were sick and tired of being on video, we had to make a lot of tough choices. So we had to reduce the staff, which was absolutely gut-wrenching that we had spent so much time finding great talent. And then within 6 to 8 months, we had to reduce the team significantly. And I actually went through that in 3 different stages, together with my executive team. But the overall weight of that starts to take a toll on you. So I had started thinking that maybe I'm not the right person to take this into the next stage, because I really believe in the energy that a founder needs to have. And if I don't feel it, it's impossible for me to, I can fake it for a while, but I don't think that you can fake it over a long period of time. So if I felt like someone else could do a better job, I've always cared more about, let's say, the team and the company and the product versus my own role in it, because I knew that I would get another job or I could start something else. Like, I was never worried about me personally, what I would do, but it was way more about, okay, how can I find someone that could take this to the next level, that has the right level of commitment, that can sort of share some of my ideas and that I trust to take it to the next level. So it's for me, it was probably a process that took, Yevgeny, 12 months from the day I started thinking that this might be something that I need to reconsider, into actually having the full-blown process done.
So it sounds like there were 2 big considerations. On the one hand, just the level of stress of going through a fast scaling period and then significant reduction of the team. And at the same time, there, not a realization, but maybe a sense that someone else could be a better person to lead the company to the next milestone.
Yeah. So for me, those were the 2 big ones, right? That I could definitely sense my energy levels. And it sometimes also takes someone else to point you in that direction, where you recognize and realize that, yeah, that's a good point. And I know exactly the story or the time that this happened to me. So I had to let go of one of the people that I had built this company with. We had spent 10 years together. This was a person that had sort of like come up through the company and was a sales director at the time. And we had to trim down some of our sales staff. And like I said, we've known each other for 10 years and we're good personal friends. And so when I said to this person that I think there might be, that you are also experiencing some fatigue and it would be good for you to try something else because this company has changed so much. He accepted this 100%, but then he said right back to me that maybe you also have to look at yourself in the mirror, because he could quite clearly see that I was exhausted and that my energy levels weren't where they were supposed to be, and even that I should potentially find another challenge. So that kind of stuck with me. Because I didn't feel like that was anything he said to be sort of like frustrated towards me, but he said that with the biggest sense of empathy, right? That I think you also need to think long and hard about your own future. And sometimes it's amazing how someone just saying that bluntly like that actually has good value for you.
Yeah. And what happened next? You said that there was a 12 months process that conversation started, but it took you a while to really make the decision.
Yeah. So obviously there are multiple stakeholders here, right? So the first thing that I did was to speak to the person that I felt could do a good job to take over from me. And so like I started circulating very sort of like softly if that is something that would be of interest if I decided that I wanted to do something else. And that is always a tricky one, of course, because you don't want to scare that person off. You don't want to give them the feeling that I don't believe in this anymore. But at the same time, at some point, you have to ask if you have a person in mind, right? So that's the way I saw this happening. I didn't think that the board would look at someone externally and start a process, and that's how this would work. I needed to own, let's call it, more of the process and present it to the board, because I knew that they would be really, not frustrated, but they would be really disappointed when I brought them this idea forward. So I felt like the more I could show them that I have thought this through, here is my suggestion, here is how I think we're going to make it work, I'll step into a board position, etc. Like all of these things I needed to have clearly mapped out. So I started speaking about this with Andy Tyra, who eventually replaced me as the CEO. And we started working on it in the evenings, right, outside of business hours, because there was so much else we needed to do. And it took us a while. It took him a little bit of time to think, is this something that I would want to do? And so on.
And what position did Andy hold at the time?
Yeah, so Andy was our CTO at the time. Very strong background from Amazon, and had taught me a great deal about sort of how to keep growing the company, but also introduce enough checks and balances to make sure that you're moving in the right direction. So because that was one of the things that I experienced when I was the CEO here, right, is that when you go from 25 to 125 people in such a short time span, there are so many things that start to break apart. So working with people that knew how to fix them and that I could basically leave alone and say, you own this one, I'll work on the commercial side, and then seeing us bridge everything together in the evenings was just super helpful. So at the time, it actually felt that I had almost what I would call a co-founder in that sense.
Yeah. And were you open with Andy at the time that you are considering a CEO transition, or you were trying to get a sense that he might be a candidate, but without really making it?
Yeah, so we've always
formal.
had the relationship where I could be fully transparent and open. And obviously he knew that I had been with this company for so many years, right? That was also a big part of my decision making, because I think I would really struggle if I had been there for just a couple of years. And for me personally, that would be feeling much more like I'm just leaving now that the going gets rough. But having had been there for 10 years, I knew what I had gone through in that time period. And so I started to accept internally that, and through conversations with you, actually, right, that I needed also to be able to understand that there's no wonder that I was starting to feel a bit fatigued, right? When you've gone through this and you've done, I think it was close to 12 years in the end, right? With all the kind of different challenges and setbacks and ups and downs we've had more existential threats than I can even remember, right? And at some point you just realize that, okay, you might not have the same willingness, the same energy levels. And also I think my past, my background at that time is also coloring what the future should look like. And that's not fair for the company either. So I could always speak to Andy about this and be open and transparent with him. And he became a really good sparring partner. So it was through these conversations that we started thinking that there might be something we can do here together.
Yeah. And I remember in our coaching conversations at the time, you were trying to find a way to navigate your desire to leave the company in a good place, not to feel like you're leaving the company in a crisis, in a bad place, but at the same time also realizing that you've been running the business for almost 12 years. You went through a number of challenges, you've navigated a number of near-death scenarios.
Yeah.
And in a way, there might never be a perfect time to say that, okay, things are perfect and now it's the perfect time to step down.
Yeah, and so I think both for me and Andy, because we were at that time running this so closely together, that we both felt that it would be best if we could navigate some of the toughest sort of like transitions, which meant, call it the ultimate downsizing, right? Like, let's get that into a safe place and then inform the team that I would be stepping out. Because I think navigating those kind of, and like I said, we did 3 pretty large changes over the course of 2 years. And so making sure that there is consistency, that there is a message that people can believe in, and then step out and then allow Andy to be the one that presents the new vision for the future, right? The one that presents, here is what we're going to be doing now. We're going to put the tough times behind us and let's rally behind another vision. So right or wrong, we felt that like that could be the definite time to actually do this. And it's like you said, timing is never going to be perfect, right? So we just had to find a time that we felt like would hit the best of 2 worlds.
Yeah. So in terms of the process, you started with having a realization that maybe stepping down could be a viable option for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
Then you went to identify a potential successor inside the business without trying to look outside. And you discussed it with Andy quite extensively before sharing it with someone else.
Yes, that's exactly right. And again, I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but that was the way that felt natural to us and to the circumstances that we were in at the time. I've always felt great trust and great support from our board and our investors. So it was never about me sort of saying that I want to step down and I don't care about any of this. Like, I really care. I feel greatly responsible for the fact that they've put money into me and into our business, right? So when they showed me that level of support, I wanted to show them that when I've considered this, it is not something I'm coming up with over the weekend where I've had a chance to think. Like, I've actually gone and done the work and I've really interrogated, is this possible? And if it wasn't possible, I'll admit, like, if Andy wasn't really ready or didn't want this, there's a big chance that I would have kept pushing and kept going, because I couldn't have seen sort of like that transition happening through someone else at the time. So for me, it was very important that when I came to them to present something, we had it more or less ironed out, and then they could decide if they wanted to support that or not. But I wanted to show them that this is not something that is sort of like coming up in the last 48 hours.
Yeah. So in other words, you came to the board not with a specific plan that you insist on, but rather a suggestion that you thought through with an explanation of what is happening and why it's happening, but ultimately leaving the decision in the hand of the entire board instead of forcing it onto them.
Yes, absolutely. And so to be fair, like in Norwegian legislation, it is the board that both hires and fires the CEO, right? 100%. So I don't own enough of the company to say that I don't believe in the board and I'm going to fire the board, right? So that was never, we had a very good working relationship, but I also knew that they were there as the checks and balances, right? So they had their job, I had my job. So rather than coming in and saying, here's what I've done, you have to accept this, I knew that that was not going to work anyway. And it's not something that's not typically the way I work. So I would then, when I had the plan, I started softly engaging with them. I had a couple that I've spent a lot of time with that were also starting to see some of the fatigue in me, right? And probably hearing it sometimes subtly and sometimes directly that I was starting to feel a bit burnt out. And so when I then went to them with a plan, they did have the confidence that, okay, this is something that we're going to have to really try and understand. And we have to understand why Øyvind is bringing this to us and then see if we can make it work. And fortunately, we had a great process when I introduced them to the plan, and I could have Andy speak to some of his ideas and the visions, etc. That was helpful in the process. But it was absolutely not easy, and they did not like it at first. Let's be real.
And can you share more about this? It sounds like you started to engage with individual board members first before having an official conversation with the entire board.
Yeah.
Did you approach people that you had the closest relationship with, or how did you?
Yeah.
How did you do it?
That's what I did. And again, that might not be like some would argue that you should definitely speak to your chair first. And to be fair, I did speak to my chair first because he was one of those that I was closest to, and a person that is very experienced and knows what I'm talking about, right? Who has been a CEO before and and an executive at large companies. So he knew exactly what I was bringing to him. And then we started discussing, okay, have one or two other board members that you talk to about this, and then we bring it up at the next board meeting and say that this is what we're proposing given the scenario. Because I think they also realized that they had seen me work night and day. I think they appreciated that I never sort of like shun away from tough decisions. They appreciated that I didn't just drop everything and say I'm done. So I also felt like there was a great deal of support from them to say, Øyvind, when you're at this level, we understand how much you've put into this business. And so we're going to help you make this transition easier. That's how I felt, at least. If that's the way they felt, I don't know. But I felt a great deal of support and trust, given that I had put a lot of time and effort into pitching it in the right way, I feel.
And you said that the board or some people on the board didn't like it. What happened then?
So I think for them, it's also a perfectly natural reaction, right? Because everyone knows that transitioning from one CEO to the next is tricky, right? So I was under no illusion that this would be a tough thing to navigate. And they had faith and trust in me. It had nothing to do with Andy, that they didn't believe in Andy, because they really did. But it was way more that they felt like, Øyvind, you need to be a part of trying to make this happen together with us. And I knew that that's how they felt, because I've always felt a great deal of support. So I also knew that I am going to have to make this very clear that this needs to happen, that I personally feel that it's the best for the company that I actually step down. And when I talked them through that, etc., it took them a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, where they really started to see that this could make sense. Because I was also very clear, I'm not going to force this, that it has to happen overnight. Like if that means me staying on for 6 months, I will, or 8 months. I just needed to know that something was being worked at that I could feel excited about and see a different path for myself in the future.
So it sounds like you've done two things, or you approached the situation in two ways that are important here. First, you came to the board prepared. You thought about it. You were very, very deliberate about what is happening and why. You did your homework together with Andy. And at the same time, you chose a very collaborative approach. You did not try to force your way through. You worked with the board to really make sure that everyone is on the same page before anything changes.
Yeah, and I think if you speak to people that have worked with me, I think they would say that I like to collaborate. You know from our sessions, right, that one of the things that gives me great energy is to achieve something together with others. And so when I tackle something as massive and challenging as this was for me, the thought of going through that completely alone and not having someone to sort of like work together with to get through it was never that was not something that was tempting to me. So it was always the need for me to find some people to work closely with me to navigate through this. So the collaboration piece has always been part of how I do things. I truly believe in the power of getting people to align and see what you're trying to achieve rather than trying to force it. So I just use that exact same methodology with the board. We've always had a collaborative connection at the board level. So for me, it would be completely out of character and also arrogant if I changed that when it came to me as a personal or as an individual.
Yeah. And the board have accepted your suggestion that Andy takes over as the next CEO.
Yeah.
Did the board consider at any point opening up an external search, even if only to compare Andy to other potential candidates?
I would say no, because I certainly didn't. I wasn't privy to any of those conversations. So, in my opinion, I can say conclusively no to that. But like I said, I don't know what happened when I wasn't part of or in those conversations. But I think this came down to the fact that we had done our homework, right? We had laid out what the plan is. If they were open to it, I could join the board. I could support Andy. I could keep working with him and make sure that he had the support because he was transitioning into a role that he hadn't held before. So there was a lot of things that we needed to show that we had thought through, and here's how we're going to be working together to make sure that it happens in the best way possible. So I just think that they had, when this came up and they realized that this is going to happen and we're going to have to make it happen, they were also then happier to tweak some of the plans that we had made and then feel like, okay, this is now a plan that we can get behind, and it's a board sort of like mandated execution that we're going into.
And generally speaking, with the benefit of hindsight, how do you think about pros and cons of hiring an internal candidate versus an external candidate in such a situation?
Very good question. I would say, for me at least, a big pro here was that Andy knew everything that was to know about the business and the history of it, right? Because this business had been on a massive trajectory where a lot of the top tier venture funds wanted to invest or get involved, etc., right? And then suddenly you're not hot anymore. And so when that happens, you want to make sure that you can attract people that are interested in the challenge for the right reasons, right? And Andy was part of this going from super hot to cold. And so he knew what he was saying yes to, right? I didn't have to pitch him a pipe dream. He knew the hard work that laid in front. He knew of all the things that needed to happen in order to get this company to where it needed to be, to go back to being a thriving business. So I think having someone that just knows that is important. Another pro is obviously that then it's a person that knows all the important stakeholders at the business. This could be just me, but I like I said, collaborating through others. And so having a strong team around me has always been absolutely crucial, and knowing what makes them tick, knowing how I so like work with one person versus the next has always been something that I find greatly interesting and inspiring, and it always leaves me learning new things. And I think having Andy view people the same way that I did and knowing how to get the best out of every single individual was something that filled me with great hope that he was the right candidate to take this to the next level, right? So knowing the stakeholders, I think, can have value. And keep in mind also Andy at that time, because he had been part of the processes where we had to downsize, etc. So he had built a great deal of trust with the team, right? We had to cut back on some of our marketing and sales, the commercial side of the business, but we wanted to really focus more on the product and building and so on. And so that's where Andy had his background. So he already had a lot of support from, call it that side of the business, that saw that he was here for the right reasons, right? And that he wanted to be part of the next stage.
Yeah. So you got to you went to the board, you explained your plan, you've got their support, and what happened next?
So when that happened, we could sort of like start then executing sort of like my path out, right? So deciding on a timeline for that, or at least a timeline that we could work towards. How would we communicate that to the team and to the stakeholders and the shareholders? How could we make sure that this transition happened as seamlessly as possible? And I think it's always, obviously there's a lot of moving pieces when you do something like this, but at the same time, I don't think we should over exaggerate this. One thing I've learned is that organizations are far more solid and rugged than we give them credit for. So when something like this happens, it's not like people break down in tears and say that this is the end of the business at all. It certainly wasn't that at Whereby. People understood my decision. I explained it to them. And then many of them just said like, all right, let's get back to business. There's work to be done, right? And I think that's the way it has to be. That's the way I always wanted it to be, that there is an organization that can make it work, even if someone that has led the business for quite a while steps out of it.
And I often think about the fact that for a founder CEO, stepping down and doing something else feels like a huge deal.
Yeah.
And when they speak to the team says, yep, makes sense. Thank you so much. Back to work. So in a way, the team really cares about the organization being run well. And who runs it well is a secondary concern to most people.
And to me, that's exactly the way it should be, right? So that might damage our egos and say, well, I thought I would see a tear, right? I thought I would say, like, I would get some flowers. But that doesn't really matter. That is purely an ego-driven thing, right? The best thing that can happen is that the organization acts just like you mentioned, right? Like, thank you for your efforts. We'll miss you. And then I got some coding to do, or I got some selling to do. Let's get back to it. This all hands is over, right? So I think that is, in my opinion, that to me at least gives me a lot more excitement and joy. and maybe even I can use the word proud that I could try and leave the company in a situation where if I stepped out, it wouldn't really change that much. And this is me saying, so I don't know how the team members felt about it, right? But I think that is part of my job as the CEO, is also to have a plan if something happens that would require a change in leadership.
Yeah. And let's go back to the timeline of the transition.
Yeah.
So you spoke to the board, and over a few weeks or a couple of months, you got on the same page about what is happening, why it's happening, and that Andy is the right candidate to replace you. How long did it take to actually step down from that point?
I think, trying to think back, I'm not the best at remembering history, but I would say probably between 3 to 4 months from actually having made the decision until I think we made the decision at a board meeting in January, and I stepped down in May. And so everything up until that point was just getting everything organized, having all the plans ready to go, tidying up the rest of the parts that I knew that I needed to make sure happened, so I could leave so like in the best state possible the business and hand it over to Andy. So I think it was like 3 or 4 months from the final board decision and then to the change.
And what happened at the moment of change? So the day comes and you're officially no longer CEO.
Yeah.
What happened? What happened next?
So I'd spoken to a lot of people, right? You and I spoke about this. I spoke to a lot of other friends of mine or people that I've gotten to know that have either stepped down or sold their businesses, etc. Right? And everyone was. I think it's funny because everyone has their different idea. There are some things that are the same, and that's all of a sudden you have so much time on your hands, right? You have so much time, and you feel like you're not worth anything anymore. I think I had been pushing it for so long with so many hours for so many years on stretch that I felt none of that. Like I just felt like a huge amount of stress and burden off my shoulders. I really started to basic stuff, like I started to dream very vivid dreams again because the whole level of stress just left my body to such an extent. So even though I was working at the time as an executive chair, I just felt like it's very, very different, and I could own my time again, which is, the more I learn, the more I see that owning your own time and having time is the ultimate luxury. So I didn't feel any of that sort of like bad feelings towards it, or that I'm losing out, or that I'm not valuable anymore, or anything like that. I just felt a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders.
And you mentioned the role of executive chair. Was that whereby?
Yes, exactly. So that was part of the transition part, that I would transition into the chair, because we had a chairperson at the time who had been with us ever since we founded the company. So just done an amazing job and gone above and beyond for so many years. And maybe that's why he was actually excited when I told him about this idea of me stepping down, because he saw that, well, that means you're taking over as the chair and I can finally step down. So there might have been some ulterior motives from his side, but it just worked out brilliantly. And so he left after 12 years and still serves as probably my biggest mentor today, right? Every time I have an issue or a problem, I can call him and get input and advice. So that worked out really, really well. But it also meant that I was close to the business. That may be one of the reasons why I didn't have bad feelings, that I didn't feel like I was completely useless. I had a lot of work to do together with Andy as the executive chair.
And how did you approach this shift from being incredibly busy? And there, again, I remember from our coaching sessions that you worked really hard. Of course, all founders work really hard because it's such an all-consuming job. But it was a huge part of your life. And then you went from there to having a lot of time in your calendar.
Yeah. It is a strange feeling, don't get me wrong. And I'm really not good at sitting idle. So I think my wife was really anxious about sort of, will he be stuck on the couch or on the couch watching Netflix and eating Doritos all day, gaining a lot of weight, and so that's sort of like not my go-to. So I think within a week, I had found another project that I could sort of like focus on and dive into and spend my time on. And it was completely unrelated to business. So I just decided that I would build our own bathroom, a pretty large bathroom from scratch, and just learn as much as I could in the process. Obviously, you need to have a plumber and an electrician to do most of the job when it comes to the stuff that they have to own. But outside of that, I just wanted to build it from scratch. And so I started by tearing down some walls and putting it back up. And I was able to finish that project before I took a new job.
And I remember you also started spending more time with your family.
Yes. That was a crucial goal for me in all this, because I do recognize that I haven't been able to be as close to my wife and my kids as I should have, obviously, because this is, it is all consuming, right? And the problem, I think, is pretty damaging as well, that I think that I'm way more important than I'm actually am for the business, right? So I have a tendency to then make decisions where I prioritize the business over my own family, which is completely mad if you think about it. Like, it doesn't make sense whatsoever. And that's purely in my head, that I think that I'm invaluable to the business, but I'm not invaluable to my kids. And it's completely opposite, right? But that took me so long to learn and understand. And I'm not perfect today, don't get me wrong, but I'm 10 times better and I can spend much more quality time. And in our conversations, you had small tips, right, that I could use that could just show them that I'm committed and I'm in the present and I'm actually with them, rather than being on my phone while we have dinner, right? Because what sort of signal am I sending to them if I'm speaking to someone on the phone when we're having dinner? So there are so many of these things that tiny tweaks that go a long way in just having a much better relationship.
And in a very weird way, sometimes I know from my personal experience, what's happening in our inbox or on Slack can feel more important and more urgent than the family that's presumably going to be around forever. But actually, it's the other way around. Like, family is so much more important than whatever emails we might have to answer.
And it's so strange. Like, I would put us in the category of being at least semi-intelligent, Yevgeny, right? Like, if maybe not the smartest on earth, but definitely not the dumbest. And why is this so difficult for us to understand? Why is this so difficult to grasp, that kind of priority does not make any sense whatsoever? Because I've also seen founders that can do the same amount of work that I could, but that were still really, really good at being present for their family. So I don't really believe that this is either or. I do think that you have to sacrifice some friendships. I think you have to sacrifice some vacation time, and you have to sacrifice a lot of community or sports or whatever. That's a given. You can't do it all. But sacrificing your family, I think really good founders can find a way to navigate those things both, especially over time. Maybe not in periods, but over time. I've seen some great founders be able to do both of those things. So it's definitely possible, but I struggle.
Yeah. And I know that you're not alone in this, because so many founders find it difficult to find the right balance.
Exactly.
And how did you think about your next professional steps? So you stepped down and at the same time, now you're a CEO of a different company. So How did you think about it, and how did you find your next CEO job?
I think that's almost like I would say almost like the story of my life, where I have a plan and then I end up tweaking that plan when something comes my way. I think ever since I was young, I've been a person that have taken opportunities that came up, right? So when I joined Whereby for the first time, it was called something else at the time. But when I joined that, like, I was doing really well in my professional life, managing bigger sales teams. But I decided to say, okay, forget all that. I'll cut my wages in half and I'll do this instead, because it feels like this speaks to me. I want to do this. And so I kind of knew, and I think I actually spoke to you about this, that part of your job as my coach now, Yevgeny, is to make sure I don't jump on something too quick when I transition out. And I had multiple people and so on reach out to me, etc., about opportunities. And some of them were quite easy to say no to. It just wasn't a good fit, or I wanted to stay in tech, where there were some other businesses that were looking for CEOs outside of tech. And that was the easy part. But then I always knew that I wanted to go back and do something, either build my own business, start something again, or see if I can take all those accumulated learnings from 12 years at Whereby, with all the ups and downs, managing a difficult cap table, like all of these things, and see if can I use that in another business and do better. And so I had the feeling that it's too soon for me to start something else by myself again, because I just don't have that level of energy right now. I need to take some more time. And then it became apparent to me that if an exciting job as a CEO of a scale-up came my way, then it would be far more interesting to take a look at. So I spoke to some recruiters, and one recruiter called me, I think it was just like 2 months after I had stepped down at Whereby, and said, like, I have the perfect opportunity, and I know you, Øyvind, you won't be able to say no to this. And we did have a process on that, and turns out he was right. I couldn't turn that down.
Yeah. And what is it like to be a hired CEO versus being a founder CEO?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and something that I've read a lot about. And I actually, some of it I agree with, and some of it I strongly disagree with, right? So right now, I'm absolutely loving it. It's difficult to say if I do a better job now versus what I did at Whereby, but I can definitely see that I'm bringing something different to this job than what I had at Whereby, because I don't feel the same emotional stress in my decision making as I did at Whereby, right? So I hopefully, at least, I can look at the situation, analyze it more in a neutral way, and then help the team to make a decision that is best for the company, that is less about emotions and feelings. This is my starting point. I don't know if that's true, but that's definitely what I feel like. So my stress levels, even though I work close to the same hours, like, it's still a big job, and it's something that excites me, and so I want to invest a lot of time into it. But I feel the overall stress levels are maybe 1/3 of what they were at Whereby. That could be a personal trait, like that I feel so much more stress when it's something that I've sort of like built from scratch versus now. And I think in a couple of years, if you ask me again, I'll be able to say if I did a good job or not, being a hired CEO versus being a founder CEO. The jury is still out on that, I think, but it's an interesting learning, and I can absolutely see some of the benefits.
Yeah. And I'm curious, what is the impact on your family? Because you said that you are significantly less stressed, but you still work fairly long hours.
I think that's where the fundamental difference is, because now I'm present, if that makes sense, right? So I might be physically in an office the same amount of time, but when I'm with them, I am present. I am there. They're not just looking through two blank eyes that are thinking about something different. Like, I can engage with them in a good way and have a discussion with them about anything relating from football to sports to their schoolwork or to their interests, right? Whereas before, because I was so stressed, I didn't even want to have those conversations. I couldn't have those conversations. So I think that they don't care, to be honest, about how many hours I'm available, but I think they care deeply about the fact that when I'm there, I should be present and engaged and able to listen to what they're actually saying. And so for me, that has been the biggest change, is that I just now know, and I can spend so much more quality time with them than what I did before.
Yeah. And that's a wonderful insight, that it's not just about the number of hours, it's about how present you can be, even if you've got a really busy job and you can be at home for only so much time.
Yeah, exactly. And so to be like in this job, I travel, like 1 week I'm at the corporate headquarters, and then 1 week I'm working from home, right? Where I live, I have another office that I'm normally at. So I'm sort of like out of the house a lot of the time. But the fact that, so some would say, well, that's not sustainable, being that much of time away from your family. But they're actually saying it's the different, like they are feeling a much, much better, so much more quality now between me and my wife and me and my kids, because I'm actually far more engaged and willing to spend time with them on a quality level. And so I've really learned that there is a massive difference between quantity and quality when it comes to this. And they are saying it too. So hopefully we can keep that going.
And when you look back at this transition, both before it happened and after you stepped down, what would you have done differently, and what would you have done in the same way?
So I would say making sure that you're honest with yourself soon enough to give you time to actually execute this without having to force it, if that makes sense, right? So this started to dawn on me quite a while in advance. I knew that this wouldn't be a quick fix. So I knew that I won't be able to get out of this in a month or two. I knew it would be a much longer haul. And so I needed to preserve my energy and make sure that I had time enough set aside to actually do this and work towards it. So for me, one of the things that really helped was the fact that I did take my time with this. I did not rush Andy. I did not rush myself. I did not rush the board. I did not rush any stage of this process in order to sort of like either get out of it faster or just to reach some sort of imaginary time frame. And I didn't have another job waiting. To be honest, the only thing that I could say is that I should have probably done it earlier. But from a time, and that's a personal feeling, right? So for me personally, I should have done it sooner. But there were also big things happening that made it so that I couldn't, but I should have, if that makes sense.
And can you say more about this? What was the moment when you feel like you should have stepped down, but didn't?
Yeah, it's such a good question, right? Because there is, I think all founders will say this, like there is still a lot of self-doubt with us, right? Even though on the surface we might seem very confident, and if we're on podcasts, we are sort of like, we can speak with a lot of confidence and say like, this is how it should be done and all that stuff. But I do think that most of the people that I talk to and people that have built massive companies, we all suffer from this self-doubt and this imposter syndrome. I think that is really something that we should speak more about. And the fact that we need more breaks and that we need more help, call it with mental, you know how much I valued our sessions, right? Because it just puts me in a different state of mind that I'm unable to put myself into. And so having someone to speak to is really, really helpful. So I would say for me, it's been almost 24 months before I started really actively talking, or before it was done, that I just don't see myself here for the long term. I'm starting to feel fatigued, and I'm starting to worry about my own well-being if I just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Now, having said that, that could have been changed if everything started to grow again and it started to be fun again, because there was so much tough decision making and everything was just really, really hard. And most of the time that I've built this company, it's been hard. But having it be this hard for those 2 years took a huge toll on me after so like a decade before that even.
So it was a decade before the pandemic, then the pandemic experience of scaling up and then scaling down.
Yeah.
Was really, really difficult for you and I imagine the rest of the team. And that was the first moment when you felt like, okay, maybe it is becoming too much, but it wasn't until someone on your team told you that maybe you're also really tired.
Yeah.
That you started thinking about stepping down.
Yeah, so I would say I probably knew 24 months in advance. Then it took me 12 months to admit it and to find a time to actually start actively working with an idea. Then it took me 3 or 4 months to work this through with Andy, another 3 or 4 months to work it through with the board, and then the final decision, and another 3 or 4 months before we actually made it public. So that would be the only thing I would say I could have done. Oh no, I should have done differently, in my opinion. That's a long period.
That's a long period, and it's also a really difficult balance to strike, because on the one hand, as founders, we need resilience. We don't want to run whenever things get difficult, and there are plenty of moments when it feels like it's too much, the challenge is too big, the company is not going to make it, and it's our resilience, our willingness to keep pushing forward is what makes a difference. But at the same time, at some point, we also need to have enough self-awareness to notice the moment when maybe actually a different leader would be the right next step.
Yeah. And imagine that is such a conflicting state of mind that I would say that can vary almost day to day, right? And if we break this down to a tiny amount of positive energy can fuel a founder for weeks. This is how mad it is, right? Like one deal that is moving in the right direction, that could be a huge one, that can fill us with motivation for like 2 months straight, right? It is pure rocket fuel into a founder. And so you're constantly battling like what is basically false hope, or what is false energy that is being injected into you. Because when you've had, and this is why I think you see so many founders have transitioned during the end of the pandemic. I think it's because the markets has been almost impossible to raise capital from, and worrying about cash flow, I think, is probably the most painful thing for a founder to ever go through. Cash flow. It's brutal. Having to downsize the team is not fun, but you can get through it. But consistently worrying about cash flow and making payroll is absolutely devastating, in my opinion. And so I think a lot of things played into the fact that I felt this fatigue, not just one factor, not just two factors, but maybe multiple factors. And then at the same time balancing that with, well, but we've done all the tough decisions, right? We are transitioning, we're seeing so like the light at the end of the tunnel. Why wouldn't you want to stay now? Because we can start to have fun again. And like I said, a deal alone, one single sales deal can fuel you. But then having the awareness to understand that someone else might do a better job here, and taking your own ego out of that.
And a lot of people listening to us right now are founder CEOs who might be in your situation a few years ago, running their own business for many years, feeling the stress, wondering whether they should maybe step down or keep persevering. What advice would you offer them?
Very difficult, because I think there are so many people that offer advice and then have no understanding of the context. So everyone would have to take their own situation into consideration. I think do whatever you can to be honest with yourself, because as founders we are deluded. Let's be real. Like that's part of the game. I thought that I could take on Zoom. Like I honestly thought that we could take on Zoom. And looking back, that's deluded. Like that's deluded to such an extent that you find it borderline psychotic. And so being diluted with yourself maybe is what's holding you back from making a right decision. So I would say just be really, really honest with yourself about what is it that you want to do, what gives you joy, and what gives you energy at the end of the day. Because if you want to build something massive, that resilience piece that you talked about, Yevgeny, is also crucial, right? And you know that you can't give up. And sometimes it takes 10 existential threats before you make it and you have fun. So these things are so highly dependent on the situation that you're in, how much you've actually put into it already. But I do think that being open and honest with yourself about what you actually want to get out of your day-to-day life is probably the crucial bit. I'm 44 years old. I'm becoming older, right? And so I start to take some sort of time to look at what have I achieved. Am I happy with everything that I've done? Which I think is perfectly natural when you start to hit a certain age. If I was 30, this would have been probably fundamentally different, because you have a lot more time to achieve things and you have a lot more energy, I would say, versus the experience. So I think the number one thing, like I said, would be just be honest with yourself and have a long, hard look at what you're doing.
And what about the investors? If you think about investors listening to us who might have companies in their portfolio where a founder CEO might have been running things for a decade and it's not a breakaway success yet, what would you like to tell them?
So I kind of agree. I heard some large VCs say that if you want to build a massive generational company, you need it to be founder-led. I think that's true. Like I think that holds true, and that makes sense to me. But most of the companies never get to that level, right? Most companies never get that kind of breakout success, and they're more stagnant in a way. They might be growing slightly, but they are a bit more stagnant. If that's the case, I think it should be far more normal and natural to both accept and also have the discussion with a CEO if this is the right role, if this is the right time, if this is the right place, etc., etc. I don't think they should be forced out of their own companies, 100% not. But I do think that having the conversation could actually go a long way in realigning and potentially get more growth or aligning the interests. So I think, again, these are tough conversations, and very often as humans, we have a tendency to push them off rather than engage them head on and have that conversation. Because I think you can still do that with a lot of respect and a lot of empathy. You don't have to be an asshole investor that comes barging into the boardroom and say, we need to replace the CEO. Like, that's obviously not going to work. But having the open and honest conversation, I think, could be useful on many fronts.
And as we're preparing to start wrapping up our conversation today, is there anything else you would like to share with our audience before we close?
I think, yeah, and it sounds like such a cliche, right? But it's sort of like it's never as bad as you think. And so put your ego outside of the equation, look at what's best for yourself and ultimately also the company, because I do think that as a founder, those things are so tightly aligned or so tightly together that not thinking about either of those is going to lead to a bad process. So, but I would say that have the process, have a plan, start at least playing around with it. And if you feel like that's draining you of energy, you might have your answer that's maybe not the direction you want to go in. If building that plan and working on it gives you energy and motivation, that to me would be a strong signal that this is something that you actually want to do. But I wouldn't dread, and again, I'm saying this from someone that I had great support in Andy. I had great support and trust with my board to start with. So before I even brought them this, I knew that they wouldn't be happy or excited about it, but I knew that they would respect me for bringing it. So that's obviously something different. If you work with a board or investors that are assholes, it might be a bit more tricky. But I would say definitely have the conversation with yourself, be honest. And if you do it, build out a strong plan and see how you feel about the time that you're actually spending working on the plan.
And as you've said, it's never as bad as it feels.
100%. Like that's exactly like with everything in a startup world. Like, we are used to being rejected, we are used to being knocked down, and we have to get back up again. This is the same kind of scenario. It's no different.
Okay. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure it will be useful and interesting to so many other people.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
To wrap up our conversation today, I would like to share a reflection. Øyvind started a company with global ambitions to compete with the likes of Zoom and Microsoft Teams as a video platform. And at the same time, he also spoke about what he called a delusion of believing that it would be possible for a small company founded and ran from a small coastal town in Norway would be able to compete with the big tech. And that's an impossible to answer question that all founders have to navigate. If we don't have a big ambition, if we don't believe that we can build an incredible company, maybe we will not. But at the same time, if we don't realize what is going on, what is realistic, and keep pushing the company forward for longer than it makes sense, then we will pay for it with our own health, our own opportunity costs, and of course it will impact on many other people, including our families. And that's the question that all founders need to navigate. I hope that Øyvind's story was useful and interesting. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and looking forward to the next episode. Speak to you soon.